mean, firstly, John Singer Sargent was an American. He's the greatest American painter that's ever lived. But no one really knows where to put him because he never really lived in America. He was an he was from Philadelphia. His father was an eye surgeon from Philadelphia, and they had a daughter who died at the age of 2. And John Singer Sargent's mother dealt very badly with that, and she had a sort of breakdown. So they went to Europe to recuperate, and she decided that she didn't want to go back to the life that they had, where he was an eye surgeon and she was a housewife, and she was very much the one that was influencing the Sargent family to stay in Europe. I don't know what the exchange rate was back in the 1850s, 1860s, but they retired and lived in Europe for the rest of their lives as expats. And because of that, John Singer Sargent was born in Florence in 1856, I think. And his mother was a big influence on his life. I mean, she was a very interested in culture, paintings, plays. She used to do sketches and watercolors, and from a very early age, she had a big emphasis on them going to the museums of Europe, and she influenced John Singer Sargent to draw. And she said that you have to finish your drawing, always finish your drawing. And from a very early age, he was. I mean, by the age of 12, they realized that he was quite the talented artist. And I don't think there was any question that he was going to do anything else with his life. I mean, I think he did, but we'll get to that. I think he did question his career at certain points, but he was just a prodigy from early on, and they realized that the only thing for him to do was to become an artist, and he enthusiastically wanted to become an artist. I mean, he was growing up with this cultured mother that was going to art museums and galleries, so he was completely submerged with art the whole time, and he was encouraged by her to draw, and she was also a keen watercolorist. So she was encouraging him to paint watercolors from a very early age. But eventually, the Singer Sargents decided that they would live in Paris, and so he grew up his teenage years was in Paris, and he went to art school, and then eventually he found himself in the studio of Carlos Duran, who was a Spanish painter, and living in Paris. I mean, at that time, Paris must have been seen as the center of the world culturally, and that's where artists gravitated to, and musicians, and it really was this cultural center of Europe. And so he found himself in Carlos Duran's studio. And in that very traditional sense, like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, they would go to the studio of their master teacher, and they would train with that teacher for a number of years before they were good enough to then go off and paint themselves. Now, Carlos Duran wasn't a particularly good painter. I mean, his paintings are okay, but they're nowhere near the level of John Singer Sargent. But he must have been a very good teacher, and sometimes in life that's how it works. The teachers are very good at teaching other people, and then they create these extraordinary pupils. So John Singer Sargent was taught he was taught the sight size method by Carlos Duran, which is a particular style of painting where you put the canvas right next to the subject in the studio, and you walk back 25 feet, something like that, and you look at the subject from a distance, and you compare it to your painting right next to the subject, and you walk up to the canvas, which is right next to the subject, and you paint exactly what you see. So it's as Leonardo da Vinci said in I think one of his sketchbooks said it's the art of, or the business of seeing is very complicated. And actually, how do you look at something, and how do you paint something? All these things have to be kind of taught to you. He must have been very talented, but he was taught by Carlos Duran how to look at the subject and paint it, what are the values, how to mix paint, how to draw, how to draw as you paint. All of those things seem to come to John Singer Sargent very, very easily, because he was painting incredible paintings from, the age of 18. In fact, why don't we put the slide up, Paola, that we
Before we
organised?
do, Nick, before we go on the slide, I wanted to just say a few things. I wanted to talk about you for a second because, in a way, you are an artistic nomad like Sargent was. You were born in Paris to Australian and parents, let's say. Your mom is from New Zealand. And now you live in London and you're also a portrait painter. So you train in Florence, and I'm wondering, how much of that classical training you received was something that Sargent would have found in his school in Paris. I know he had a very tough teacher who never gave compliments. And, how was that for you, that artistic education?
Yeah, incredible. And we talked a lot about John Singer Sargent. He was. We just admired him so much. He's a strange artist because no one really knows where to put him. He grew up in a time. He came up in a time where, the Impressionists were really fashionable painters. People like Monet and Renoir and Pizarro, whoever, Seurat. That was the sort of the fashionable, the fashionable thing to be into at the time, and John Singer Sargent didn't really fit into that sort of clique, into that world. So and then like you say, he's an American, but he never lived in America. He wasn't French. And when he first went to England, the English thought he was too French. And the Americans, well, what happened basically is he, well, thank you for comparing me to John Singer Sargent, but I don't think anyone really compares to John Singer Sargent. There's
Well,
no one
but
that paints like no one can paint like John Singer Sargent. There's no one alive that can, and there's very few artists that ever got as close. I mean, even if you look at Velasquez paintings, technically he's incredible. Velasquez is incredible, but they're stiff paintings compared to Sargent. Same with Van Dyck. There's a bit more movement in Van Dyck, but they're still stiff compared to Sargent paintings. Sargent is really up there technically with the greatest painters that have ever lived. You'd say technically, Van Dyck, Velasquez. You could even put Rembrandt into that group. But Rembrandt was a very eccentric painter, very difficult to but amazing. But a bit like Turner in the sense that it's very hard to understand how he painted. But they're some of the greatest painters in the world. And then 200 years later, John Singer Sargent comes along. He's one of the greatest painters technically that's ever lived. But I think, like I said, the Impressionists were really popular at the time. And I think in a way, John Singer Sargent wanted to be a bit of an impressionist. He used to idolize Monet, and he sort of in his travel paintings, he kind of tried to do sort of Monet-esque impressionist paintings, which sort of fail in a way. That it's strange that you'd say that John Singer Sargent's paintings would fail, but he was just trying to be a little bit too much like Monet, and he didn't need to be. But who knows what was going through his head at the time? I mean, it was very fashionable back then to, there was a sort of season to painting. You would paint all winter and then into the spring, and then in the summer you would go traveling, and that's when he would do his travels to Spain and to Venice and to, he went down to the Holy Land at one point. And so, most summers he would go off and he would paint, and he would do his landscape paintings, his plein air paintings, and but he did so many paintings. I mean, there's over 2,000 paintings that he did, just paintings alone, and there's something like 650 drawings. So he was prolific. I mean, this is a man that just from a very early age was just painting every single day, non-stop. It totally consumed his life, and He didn't even, he never got married. Was he gay? Who knows? There's nothing written about it. People like to say, that very cliche way, he was married to his art. That people say.
But I think in a way
Yeah, I
that
mean,
works.
he really was. He really
He
was.
really was, he reminded me a little bit of Michelangelo in a way that there is really like no any proof of any kind of liaison with anyone, right? Michelangelo writes poems to some man that he falls in love with, but like did he really? Anyway, I think there's so much to be said. And you're right, such
Doesn't
a
even
great,
matter. I mean, his
yeah, exactly.
romantic relationship, for me, it's of no interest. Yeah, if he was gay, there's no record of it. If he and if he had a woman in his life, there's no record of that either. The only records that there are of him talking about to other artists. I mean, he would talk about varnishes that he liked, and he would talk about paints that worked for him, and he would talk about mediums that he liked to use and things like that. But very little. I mean, he seemed like a guy that just used to throw letters in the bin. There's really nothing written about him. There's a few things written about him. There's a wonderful letter where he's describing to another artist how he paints, and he says, use a lot of paint, thick paint, and draw with the paint and blend everything into everything. And so I always try and think of that when I'm painting, just blend everything into everything. You just try, don't make it piecemeal. Just try and bring it all together.
And Nick, and what was that
Like
favorite
some.
quote of him? You told me about a favorite quote. Each portrait is a painting with something wrong with the mouth or a smile.
Yeah, a portrait is a painting with something wrong with the mouth, which is so true. It's so hard to get mouths right. They're like a world unto their own. They're very difficult to get right, and to think that Sargent couldn't get them right gives me hope because
Well,
if you
I
can't get
let's
it right, then
say,
who can?
let me see. I'll
So,
share our screen. What do you think? We can start with some of the images.
yeah.
Let me see if
Well,
I can.
now that we've set the scene, yeah, this is the great man himself, and he just looks like such a jovial, lovely, cultured man. I'd love to have sat down and talked to him. He would have known. Apparently, he played the piano, and he looks like he liked to drink, and he looks like he liked to eat good food. Um, he looked like he enjoyed life, and he grew up with parents that like to enjoy life too. So it was very much part of his just the way he was, of his lifestyle, the way he naturally was, and uh, he just looks like a great man. I admire him very much. A man that just dedicated himself to painting and didn't have to do anything else. What wonderful! And this was his teacher, Carlos Duran, who was a stern taskmaster. And this was him sort of graduating from the studio in 1879 and painting, his teacher. And what a painting it was, very different from his later painting. He blended the paints a lot more. He used a lot of glazes in his earlier work. Whereas his later work was much more wet and wet, and he would just sort of go for it. Um, he makes very, very difficult things look very easy. And the thing is with Sargent, there is records of him scraping down over and over again, scraping back the canvas. He would do a session of painting, and if he didn't feel that he got what he wanted to get, he would scrape it all back and he would go again the next day. And um, the end result looks like he just got it in one go, but that wasn't at all what the actual process of the painting. And these earlier paintings, that he uses a lot more glazes, like Velasquez would have, um, but he admired Frans Hals a lot. And actually, in his studio, there was lots and lots of copies of Frans Hals paintings. And Frans Hals was a very direct painter later on in his career as well. With the broken brushwork and just blending, wet in wet as you paint. But anyway, yeah, let's go to the next slide.
I just wanted to point out this little red pin that we see, just a little dab of red. This was a beautiful pin given to him by the French Legion of Honor for kind of his attributions to the field of art. And I wanted us to, remember this because we will get to see Sargent himself later on with the same pin. So I just love this. He's in his studio in his school for 4 years. And then he kind of does this almost like his own introduction to say now I'm on the scene as well, and people can commission from me. So
But I mean, look at the colors that he used. Everything is so well designed. He uses that Viridian turquoise seat. Then there's a sort of dark green pantalon, and then there's a lighter green jacket with the black beard, the black hair, and the sort of the whitey green, silvery background. People say, "Oh, Matisse was such a colorist." I always think, what on earth do they think is good about Matisse's color? He just uses bright colors. This is a man that understands color. This is Sargent understands how to use color. This is an incredible color combination, incredibly well designed. Your eye starts at the top left-hand side and it goes down with a flick on the bottom right of his hand with the perfect symmetry of color. You can't get a better portrait than this. This is the greatest work ever done. Okay, let's go to the next. He was great friends with all the Paris lot. I mean, so Rodin was there, the great sculptor, and apparently he even started a sculpture of a bust of Sargent that was unfinished, and has been since lost. But this is an amazing portrait. I've seen this in the flesh. Yes, last year there was a beautiful exhibition in London of Sargent and fashion, and this was one of the paintings in that exhibition. And they're astonishing to look at. I mean, I see them so much in books. It just does it no justice, obviously. When you see them in life, it's like seeing an old friend that you know, and it's always astonishing to see the quality when you actually see the quality up close. But anyway, yeah, this is, I mean, Rodin. The next one is, I think, Monet. He's very good friends for his whole life with Monet. And Monet was a sort of a similar guy. Of course, Sargent spoke four languages. He spoke fluent French. He basically grew up in France, and he spoke Italian and he spoke English, obviously, because his parents were, English-speaking Americans, and he also spoke German. But he would have, he was great friends with Monet, and they traveled together. Like I said, the sort of the fashion, well, not the fashion, but the seasonal nature of painting back then, where in the summer you would usually travel and go, traveling and painting. You'd go with your painting friends, you would go with your artist friends, and he went with Monet. They traveled together and they painted together, and this was his profile of his friend Monet.
I also love that he gave this painting as his diploma work in the National Academy of Design in 1897, which I think is really neat because he's kind of paying an homage to an older colleague and a friend, but also connecting himself in a way to this legacy that Monet started. And as you said, Nick, he spoke
Well, I
all
think he
languages.
admired Monet very much. Monet Monet was a very good painter. He understood color. And he was really doing groundbreaking things in art. I mean, he was considered a modern artist at the time. And Sargent, I think, wanted to be slightly like that, but didn't really know how with his classical training, and maybe didn't have the the guts to do it, or wasn't brave enough to try. But he just stayed in his lane, Sargent, and he was very, very good at what he did. But I think he looked at Monet in sort of admiration because
And
there are some paintings where you think, oh, he's kind of trying to be like Monet there, but there's no paintings where Monet's trying to be like Sargent.
you know what? I think it's also interesting you said, he spoke all these languages, right? Which I think is really lovely because he could speak to his sitters in their own native language. And also he's seen as an outsider everywhere he comes. In England,
Yeah,
I think he even describes himself like, oh, I hope I can make my name in England because they see me as beastly French, and then
yeah.
for Americans, he's actually kind of a European artist. He spoke English with an English accent,
Well,
not
no,
because.
he was the Americans loved Sargent. They were the one country that welcomed him with open arms. He was sort of seen like a returning hero coming back to America, and they were very, very generous to Sargent, the Americans. But he didn't feel American. Yeah, he never grew up there, so he didn't really feel American, even though he knew he was American. So it was one of those funny things. But the Americans absolutely took them as took him in as one of their own.
Yes. And I think the British wanted to give him the actually English passport, which he refused. Anyway, we'll talk more about this. Let's keep going. This is one of his first real entries to the French Salon, right? Of
Yes, it was, and
1882.
I think this was the year before he entered Madame X in, which was we'll get to, and which was a disaster. But um, this was very Velasquez inspired. I mean, you can see the colors here are the silvery colors of Velasquez that Velasquez used, and it's very loose. The painting's very loose. It almost looks unfinished. I mean, you can see the guitars on the top right. They're very unfinished, but actually because they're in the background, you don't really need to finish them because they kind of gives a blur to it's sort of they sink back into the background and all the focus is on the dancer. But this painting is just so alive. I mean, look at the man clapping, the shadows on the wall, and the men playing guitar. It just looks absolutely alive. And like you said before about color, you know, the symmetry of color that he's got in this, the Velasquez-esque silvery grays and things with that pop of red. That's someone that knows color and knows how to make the eye, how to design a painting to, be in control of where your eye goes and everything like that. It's just incredible control. He did this when he was very young as well. He was in his 20s, and this was considered a real success at the Salon in Paris. He was admired, and he was an up and coming artist that the French really took on board as one of their own, and he was considered an up and coming, real talent in the Parisian art world. And then if you go to the next slide.
I just wanted to say, look at that hand of the dancer. Does she remind you a little bit of Caravaggio?
Little bit. I mean, he was looking at everything, but yeah, I mean, he would
I
have
think
known
he,
Caravaggio. He would have known the old masters. I mean, the thing is about Sargent is he had a deep knowledge of art history, and he was using the old master language of the old masters in these at the time they were considered modern works of art, and he was doing that much more than other painters, I think, and because he had the technical facility to do it, to be able to do it as well. He admired Manet, but I don't think Manet could paint anywhere near this level.
we do have a
Um,
Manet. Here is Manet because he admired him deeply. These are the both of these were on the Salon of 1882. Both of them kind of considered a great success.
Yeah, I mean, they must have been friends, and I think he admired Manet because Manet painted, was considered a painter of modern life. They look dated to us now, these paintings, but at the time they were very modern. A woman at a bar, these things hadn't been painted before, and I think Sargent wanted to do things like this. He was considered a little bit maybe conservative, not really breaking ground like Manet or Monet, but technically he was. I mean, he was just doing with these incredible, incredible works of art. But I think he wanted to paint sort of things like this, modern life, and fascinating scenes like this.
Then we come to
It's
nightlife.
hard to know.
These guys,
It's
they're having fun, right? They're having fun in their nightlife excursions. I love that we're actually looking at the mirror, right? So we get to see the back of her and the man who is actually probably ordering a drink. So kind of this window into the space behind her as well.
I
Yeah,
don't get the impression that Sargent was sort of like Picasso or, or Dali or anything of any Van Gogh. I think he would enjoy a good meal and a couple of drinks, and he was just back in the studio the next day painting.
yes. I love the detail. This is just incredible.
Yeah, you can see how loosely it's painted. You can see I mean, you can see the influence that Frans Hals had, the broken brushwork, the looseness that he admired. Um, yeah, but I mean, this looks like it's painted quite quickly. A self-portrait when he was young. He painted one when he was young, another one when he was young, and another one when he was later on in his life. It was like he only painted three, and they're all the same pose. He only painted three self-portraits in his life. They're all the same pose as well. Um, I don't think he was
No,
particularly interested in what he looked like, to be honest.
you know what's also interesting? All the three portraits he actually did, self portraits, were commissioned by someone else.
No,
So
interesting.
it's not even
Not
him.
like Rembrandt then, totally obsessed with what he looked like. He was better looking than Rembrandt as well. Don't know why Rembrandt was so obsessed with himself. He's
Well,
not a
I
very
think,
good looking
I
man.
think the sergeant also had such a busy schedule. He didn't have time to be looking at himself in a mirror. Why do that when he can actually be paid probably an
Yeah.
equivalent of $120,000 today for every portrait he did. So, just incredible. Like, I guess, well, we will talk later about the prices some of the museums pay to get his works. But I do have to say, the Uffizi got one for free, and we will talk about that in a bit.
Well, he was born in Florence. Um, this is now, it's considered an iconic image. It's considered an iconic work of art. And I think we look at it through those eyes. But when he painted this and displayed this the next year at the Salon, in the 1883 Salon, it was laughed at. It was laughed at. People would come to literally laugh at this painting. I mean, to the point where, that's what they would do. They would actually gossip about the painting and go and laugh at it. Which is unbelievable, really, because we look at this painting as it was this sort of iconic, symbolic work of art. And Sargent at the time, he met Madame Gertrude, she was American, and she had this incredible profile, almost like a peacock. And he wanted to capture that. He wanted to paint her profile, this beautiful skin color that she had, and he painted this iconic work of art. But when it was displayed at the Salon, it was completely laughed out of town. It was considered too sexual, over sexual. The profile was considered, her nose was considered too big. It's hard to really get our heads inside the world of 1883, 1884 Paris to kind of understand that, because I think we look at it through modern eyes, where it's considered this iconic work of portraiture. But at the time, it was just considered a joke. To the point where he couldn't live in Paris anymore. No one would commission him after this painting. No one wanted a painting by Sargent after this, because no one would want to risk being painted like this and laughed at.
Uh,
So his
Incredible.
career essentially was over in France like that overnight. And so he had grown up in France and Paris and all over Europe, and I think he considered himself, quite European. And but then he, for a time, thought, maybe I'll stop painting. And then I think he sort of turned his head towards England, and he thought, well, I'll be sort of more Anglo-American, and live in London. Like, there was some great expats like Henry James, who he painted, who I think talked to him and told him to come to London and restart his career in London.
Nick, I think it's fascinating to think that she was 25 when and she was
Mm,
already kind of the gossip columns would always be filled with the stories about her. Even though she was,
mm.
I think, yes, she was born in New Orleans. Her birthday was just a few days ago, actually. Um, and then she goes, I think, to Paris at the age of 8. So she was kind of like an outsider as well. But one thing to be said, it was
He
Sargent.
didn't. He didn't. He. She didn't commission him for this. He
Exactly.
wanted to paint her. He came up with the idea for this. Completely came up with the design. He thought it would be a groundbreaking work of art. It would be the next. It would be the thing that people talked about in a positive way in the salon. With her profile, with her peacock-esque kind of profile, with that incredible nose that she had and the skin tone. But it didn't have that effect at all. And the French just totally ran him out of town.
It changed
And
the course. It changed the course of her life, and I think his life as well, as we will see. I do have,
absolutely, it changed the course of his life. He had to leave. He had to leave very soon after this, and he took it with him. He took the painting with him, and he
yeah,
had it in his studio for many years.
he had it for 30 years
Yeah.
until he actually offered it to to the Met only after she died. In 1915, I believe he writes them a letter and he gives them a very reasonable price. He asks £1,000 for it, which would have been maybe $120,000 today. But I think what is interesting, Nick, in a salon full of paintings of nudes, this woman who was, after all, dressed, is the one who causes the scandal. And I don't think we have the detail of the little strap that was actually loose, but it
Mm.
was the strap that he had to repaint. And here are just a few details, Nick, if you want to comment on them.
Well, yeah, apparently he painted her face over and over again. It took something like 100 takes. It looks like he painted it in one go, but he actually didn't. He painted, and you can see because of the cracking, it was thick, it was thickly painted. And he'd scrape back and he would try and get it over and over again. And it took him many, many attempts to get it, to get what to achieve the effect that he wanted, and eventually he got what he wanted, I guess. But
And I
yeah,
think,
it just looks so simple. He makes something look that is so difficult to achieve, especially a profile. Profiles are very difficult to get the proportions right, and he just makes it look easy, even though it took him a long time to get it right. But yeah, it's
I
the
think
genius of Sargent.
it's interesting to see here that how much makeup she had on, that kind of the powder that she would have used, and then you could have see how she's actually blushing, how red is her ear, and I think
Yeah.
the people were commenting even on that in Paris in a very negative way, on that kind of flushed ear. But yes, she's definitely a painted lady, right?
Yeah, just beautiful details. I mean, doesn't get better than Sargent. He's the greatest. But yeah,
I love how her wedding band is just a one tiny dab of gold.
incredible, isn't it?
Yes,
So
yes.
simple. He just makes everything look so simple, and it's really, really not. It's some of the hardest.
Yes, and I think, Nick, they probably put two of these young expats, they had no idea they were actually defying conventions so much. I don't think they expected that they would be thrown out of town,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, I'm just repeating, okay?
And here is the painting, actually in his London studio. He kept the painting with him for 30 years before actually offering it to the Met. And in the letter that he writes to the director, he actually asks him to just have her as Madame X, not to mention her real name. So, which I think is really interesting. And I think it's really lovely to see interior of his studio, which reminds me so much of Museo Fortuny in Venice today.
Oh, it's just absolutely stunning, his studio. Amazing to see pictures like this of how he lived and worked. Yeah, beautiful.
And
Would
then
have
look
been
at,
very comfortable.
I love, just how much she's still echoed in even in our own contemporary culture, and even
Yeah.
Madonna.
Like I said, she's so iconic in our contemporary culture, but at the time she was laughed out of town, and the painting was laughed out of town. To the point where he had to leave Paris. It's quite an extreme thing.
And he lives
Um,
there. That's actually Henry James that calls him to London. He actually writes and said something like, he's an honest man, and I really look forward to seeing what his future will be.
yes,
I
yeah.
think this is the third portrait.
Henry James was also an American expat living in London, and so Sargent decided that he would turn his attention to sort of more Anglo-American view of the world, and go to London and restart his career in London. And at the beginning, the English didn't really take to him. He struggled. He didn't get many commissions, uh, and if we go forwards, I think we've got the picture of the first commission that he got in America, which really changed his career.
Oh,
This is Tite Street. I've actually been to his studio in Tite Street. Unfortunately, it's been turned into luxury apartment. A luxury apartment flat now.
it looks like
But
this.
that's what always happens with these artist studios. That the artists haven't got the money to keep them. But such is life.
This is the
And then
entryway. Yes. Okay.
yeah,
Here.
it's just
Here we
down
go.
in
Here is
Chelsea. And this was his first commission in America. So he went to London, and he was sort of trying to, make his name known in London, and he was struggling. And then he got this call for a commission in America, and when he arrived in America, he was welcomed with open arms. The Americans really saw him as this artistic hero returning to, the place of his family and where he was from. And he just commissions just were nonstop after that. Um, he was in great demand. He
I
was
think
in great, great demand.
I think with these, Nick, maybe you can talk a little bit about his process because here are some really good. It's interesting that
Yeah,
he's
so as I was saying
blurry.
before, he was taught by Carlos Duran to paint sight size, which is putting the canvas next to the sitters and then walking back and viewing the sitter from a distance and then going back up to the canvas and with your memory and your visual memory and your observation, actually painting what you see from life to the size of life, because all his paintings are painted to life size scale because he had the the canvas, the portrait commissions were painted basically to life size scale because he had the canvases right in front of the sitters. And if you have the canvas slightly behind, they're a bit bigger, and if you have them slightly in front, they're a little bit smaller. But if you have them right exactly next to the sitter, they're about the same life size. And you can see in these images is exactly the process that he was doing in his studio.
And look how amazing that studio looks like. And plus, look, if you look at Sargent on the right, he's blurry. And even here, it's almost like he never really stood still. I guess
Well,
he,
for those daguerreotype silver plate portraits, you have to be exactly still. And photography was an early art form back then. It was an early technology back then. So I don't think he probably didn't know that you had to or stand quite so still, even for a portrait painter who would have asked his subjects to sit still. But
look how
um,
they are. They're like perfectly, perfect. In each of the paint photos, you see them kind of, as just
it's
great.
amazing to see because if you go to the next slide, that we can actually see the final painting. It's amazing to see him painting this, you know, in photographs, to see him working and how he would have worked. It really gives you an idea of his life and how he would have occupied his days. Really insightful.
You know what's interesting too? We know that this woman was an intellectual. I think she was even offered a place to teach at university that she turns down. But apparently she wanted to be painted in a gray, like a very drab gray dress. And he insisted that she has something more feminine. So this is the dress that was actually from her sister-in-law that she borrowed just for the painting.
Yeah.
But I think it's very
And you
interesting.
can
I
see
guess
the
they are,
green in the top left-hand corner.
yeah.
Green goes so well with pink. They complement each other so well. Um, and grey goes with pink as well. He's one of the greatest colorists. As people say, colorist, which I never really understood. I never really understand what that means, but um, he understood how to design color in a way that really few painters are at this level. Um, Carnation Lily Lily Rose was painted over 2 summers, and he was at his friend's house, and he would get these children to pose at twilight every night for months on end just to get this specific light. When you're looking at this painting, there is the light of twilight. There's that silvery twilight with the lanterns on. It's incredible. You can't really get the feel from the computer image, but it's at the Tate Britain, and it's amazing to see, and it's really thick, and you can see that he's painted over and over and over again to achieve the result he wanted to achieve, and it's painted without much medium, just straight out of the tube. I guess he was using paints from the tube. He would have probably been mixing lead white as well, but it's thickly painted on top of over and over each other. He was just going for this. He was going for this, what he was trying to achieve, over and over again, and it's an incredible painting. Yeah, I mean, he was friends with Robert Louis Stevenson, very good friends, and he had lots of very cultured people like this that he was in, in these circles of these people. This is a bizarre painting. I mean, if Robert Louis Stevenson looked like this in real life, well, he must have. But his fingers look these tiny little fingers that he's got, and these skinny legs, and he looks like a very peculiar man.
I think, Sargent actually describes him as a very, that he says he's never seen a more agitated person, like a nervous, this nervous
Well, he
energy.
looks like that from the painting as well. You can see he looks, he looks thin with, nerves, like a nervous energy, like he lives and functions on nervous energy.
And I love kind of the empty space around him and then his wife. I think even Stevenson said, like, my wife looks like a ghost. But
Yeah.
she almost like she's this, Moroccan kind of figure there, interestingly. Because there's like a divide between them, that's for sure. He does paint this
Yeah. And
writer.
also just,
Here's another one of his. And I love it. It's
yeah, you
actually,
can see
it's a,
that,
mhm.
the long fingers of Robert Louis Stevenson are very interesting. He doesn't look that well though, does he? He doesn't look very healthy. Looks like he
Actually, you know what?
smoked a lot and quite nervous.
Here he was actually already, I think, sick when he paints this. This is the third of the three portraits he did. And it was actually commissioned by a banker in the US who gave it to gift as a gift to his wife, who was a big fan of Stevenson. Nick, I love how his shoes kind of get out of the frame.
Yeah, I mean, his design, we don't think enough about, how a painting is designed because, it's very hard to really, break it down. You're just looking at an image, but when you're painting a painting, it's all these things you have to think about all these things. How is this image going to work? How am I going to achieve this, this image, and how am I going to make it work on the canvas? And I can't tell you how difficult it is to, get the hands to work right. Get the colors to work right, get the legs to not look too long and get the body to, look in proportion with the legs. Everything just in symmetry. And he just gets it right. He really does get it right.
How long do you think they would have to sit in this pose? For how long?
Hard to know. Later on in his career, he painted very quickly. Earlier on in his career, he was quite I think he was ambitious and he really wanted to get things right. And I think he set himself very high standards early on in his career. And he built this incredible name, but for himself. But I mean, later on in his career, I think he was painting really quite quickly.
And I think even
Hard to
look,
know. I think like Lily Carnation, Lily Rose. I think he just for 2 summers went for it.
I want to just say about this one. I think he does this one for the 70th birthday of Henry James, and it is actually the Friends, Circle of Friends, who commissions him to do this. And by this point, we are now in 1913. Sargent is like sick and tired of painting portraits, and he does this. I think he even like confesses to Henry James that he's tired, that he doesn't really want to do this. But I think he does.
Yeah.
Look at
He
the
gave
way.
up on painting portraits. He basically retired from painting portraits. He just wanted to still paint, but he didn't want to do commissions anymore. And so what he did was he did charcoals of people that asked, and charcoals would have taken a couple of hours. Um, and so, I mean, there's even records saying that he'd do a charcoal head in half an hour. So.
Wow.
Um, he would give the charcoal heads to people, and there's many charcoal heads of his. But yeah, essentially he got sick of painting portraits and wanted to focus more on his landscapes. And then of course he did the famous mural series that he did in Boston, which took him about 30 years. He wanted to focus on that as well, but he felt like he'd sort of done enough portraits in his life. I mean, we're talking he'd done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of portraits. So
Yeah.
he was late. It was later on in his career, and he felt like he'd done it. Fair enough.
But yes, and I think 800 portraits. That's a big number. And Nick, the next part. This is also very kind of similar to Sargent because you too live in a palazzo in Venice, and let's talk about his Venetian moments a bit. I love, and I was thinking about this. How much Sargent actually paints Venice and how much he's inspired there. Yet, I don't know really of any works he does in Florence. Even though he's Florentine
Yeah.
born, I don't see him doing watercolors, the streets around the Duomo.
I've also thought that. I've also thought that. I think he does a few of Florence. There are a few watercolors of Florence, but yeah, he painted extensively in Venice. I mean, you could tell he loved the place. I
And
mean, to
this
the
is
point where he had a deep, deep love for Venice. I mean, he painted the locals, he painted street scenes, he painted landscape paintings on the lagoon, he painted interiors. He really did paint Venice very well. I think he must have loved the light. The light in Venice is very special. Um, it would have been very interesting. It was quite a poor city when he was there. And I think he was fascinated by the culture of the place, a very unique culture. There was no bridge to Venice at the time. He would have had to go there on the boat. And I think because of that island sort of mentality and island culture, it had a very unique culture to it. And he really captured Venice like no one else. I mean, he really did capture Venice, the life of Venice. You can really see what it was like. If you go back a couple to the lady in this street scene. I mean, these street scenes of Venice are so lifelike. You can really, really tell what it would have been like, and it hasn't really changed. I mean, the streets look exactly the same colors with the faded pinks and reds and the greens on the shutters. Um, it's the same as it is now. It's just the characters that populate Venice are slightly different, but he really captures this moment in time. And I think there's some of the most amazing paintings in his career that he did. I really, but I think he painted these quickly. I think these paintings were painted quickly. I think he would have done the portrait. You're asking how long does it take to paint. I think he would have done the portraits, especially earlier on in his career, quite slowly, and he was quite ambitious with what he wanted to achieve. But with these, I think he would have painted them quite quickly. I think he would have got different sitters, whoever's in this painting, they would have had to have stood for him for a little bit, and he would have probably paid them for that. But I don't think long, maybe an hour at most. Um, and he would have just captured them plein air, wet in wet, and very quickly. But he had the technical capability to obviously do these quick paintings and very, very well.
Nick, I also wonder, we don't have a Sargent painting any of the big landmarks. He doesn't do like San Marco or the high society in a way. He really is interested to see people at work. And many of these watercolors also are from the gondola, almost like framing the scene like he would do with a photographic lens. But I just wanted to talk quickly about, his friends. And this is the portrait of the Curtis family in Palazzo Barbaro. And I love, Nick, that we actually know people who live there today. I think it's just absolutely incredible. And I just wanted to, like, here I put
Yeah,
in some
I think that's
information.
also a little bit his downfall because he was considered to be someone that just painted rich people, and he was forgotten by art history for a long time. And because I think he was just considered to be a portrait painter, someone that painted rich people. There was a retrospective of his work in uh, can't remember when it was. I think it might have been in the 80s at the Museum of Birmingham by his great nephew Richard Ormond that did he was the director of Birmingham City Museum, and he was the son of John Singer Sargent's sister Violet. And oh no, sorry, he was the grandchild of Violet Sargent, and so he was, he was John Singer Sargent was his great uncle, and he said that the review of this retrospective was a painter of the stinking rich. So art history has sort of looked at him a little bit like that, someone that painted the privileged, someone that painted the wealthy, um, and maybe someone like Van Gogh um, was considered a little bit more sort of meat and potatoes and maybe a little bit more earthy and relevant or something like that. I think there's a bit of a snobbery towards Sargent. His subjects, many of them were the wealthy and the rich, but that he also painted these street scenes and things like that, and that kind of gets forgotten. But anyway, it is what it is. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, I think just for Palazzo Barbaro, just to mention, it was bought by this American Daniel Sargent Curtis, who actually was director of the Boston Pub. Well, he was in the trustee of the Boston Public Library and director of the Boston National Bank. And he buys the palazzo in 1885. And then, all these people who would have been there coming to visit. Robert Browning gives his last public reading before he died, just a few days before he died. Isabella Stewart Gardner would be renting the place often. And then Henry James would have been there, Claude Monet, Baron Berenson. So I just love of these men thinking that they would gather in Venice and discuss all these wonderful ideas and work on their really exciting projects.
As
Um,
they still do. I mean, the art world still congregates in Venice for the
I
Biennale.
know.
Nothing changes really. But yeah, this was really the inception of that. Is it the inception? And Venice has always been the center of the arts. I mean, you had Titian and Tintoretto, and this period of time, it was the Impressionists and Sargent and Henry James, the writers, and it's always attracted the great artists of the world. It's just a magical place.
And I think, his own
Welcome to the best restaurant in town, Your Kitchen. Today's special, oxo tomato and basil soup for less than £1 per portion. Fry off the onion and garlic until softened, pour in the passata, and now for the magic ingredient. Stir in a vegetable oxo stock pot for effortless depth of flavour. Oxo, food you love for less than £1 per portion.
critics basically say, oh, it seems that the most popular painter of portraits of all of the world, when he goes to Venice, he just becomes an ordinary tourist because they couldn't really understand what he was doing, doing these kind of street scenes that he produced, in so many different
Yeah, and a lot of them, like this one here on the left, you can see this was just painted in a boat. He would have had an umbrella above him, or he would have been in the shade on the side of the canal, and he would have just painted this scene. And often when you look at Sargent paintings, a lot of them are these random scenes that he just sees anything, and he was that good. He could just see anything, and he could just paint it. He was that talented.
And of course, you don't really need a easel. You can do a watercolor in your own lap, right? So much easier.
Yeah. It would have been. He would have had all kinds of traveling tools to paint with.
You know,
Um,
I just wanted to share this one. Here we see Isabella Stewart Gardner on the right, and you can see the terrace of Palazzo Barbero. This was not done by Sargent, but you're going to see this.
yeah, that was done by his great contemporary, who also cracked America or made his career in America. Was Anders Zornes, very famous Swedish painter who was incredibly good. Um,
And it's apparently the
yeah, so
moment when
it's
she,
wonderful. There's a wonderful motion in that portrait, a wonderful energy to it.
I think she's actually calling her friends to say, come to the balcony, see the fireworks. So
It
it's like
looks exactly like that, doesn't it? Come to the
Todhunter, I
balcony, look at,
believe.
yeah, look at what I can see. Come and have a look.
And look at what Berenson said about her. She was basically a big client. She would be buying paintings, and Berenson was kind of her advisor on what to get. She lives at a rate and intensity with a reality that makes other lives seem pale, thin, and shadowy. And she's also the woman who had a huge loss. Her son died, and I think this was the trip to Venice was really kind of to keep her spirits up, and it is why she would come so often. At the end, inspiring her own museum in Boston. It kind of looks like a Venetian palace. I have not been to Boston yet, so I can't wait to go and see. But I just wanted to show two portraits that he does of Isabella Stewart Gardner. What do you think about this one, Nick?
It's bizarre, don't you think? I mean, I love it because it's just Sargent. Everything he does is amazing. But yeah, it looks like she's sort of coming out of the depths of hell. And she's got a rather plain look on her face. It's not the greatest Sargent portrait in the world. She's
Well,
got
it's
she's got a bizarre sort of look to her.
it,
Um, but I think she probably encouraged it. I think she said, just do what you want, do a really avant-garde, strange, modern piece. And I think Sargent probably came up with this bizarre painting. That
yes.
rather wonderful though.
I think, what's interesting about this is we see her love of Venice because he actually paints this beautiful brocade behind her. So kind of a Venetian textile. And she kind of look, well, Henry James, said that she
It
looks
looks like she's wearing it though. I mean, it literally looks like she's wearing the wallpaper as a hat.
yeah.
Um,
Henry James described this as a kind of a Byzantine Madonna, and because of that, I guess this halo effect. But her husband said to her something like, "You, it looks like hell, and it looks like you." And he said that during his lifetime, this should never be exhibited in their home, and it actually wasn't. She respected her husband's wish, which I think is quite interesting. So there she is. She's about 47 years old when he does this one. But I think the other one, this watercolor that he does just 2 years before she died, I think is
yeah,
just,
not long before he died as well.
yes. So look at this. At this point, she's in her early 80s, and no one really she doesn't really have so many friends, I think. She doesn't really accept everyone, right? But he does come for a tea. And it's interesting that she agrees to pose for him or kind of gives him the permission to paint her in this very kind of intimate setting. And I love
Yeah,
that.
he really captures the moment, though. I mean, that's the genius of Sargent. He really captures these moments in time that I mean, you really can understand this moment in time. You know, not everyone can do that. There's a facility that he has that's very, very. He just paints the atmosphere as well as the psychology of the sitter, and it's just incredible capacity for paint that he can do. And he could do this with watercolor. He could do this with drawings. He could do this with oil paint. You know, he could just do it all.
I love that, there's this, obviously she has this white blanket, which it kind of wraps around her. So she looks like an, empress sitting on a throne. And look at this, the
Yeah,
deep.
I think she was quite sick at the time. That was the thing, and I think that's why she didn't want to be painted because she was very unwell.
But
Um,
yes. But look at the way how much dignity he gives her, almost like she looks like she's someone who is
Otherworldly.
otherworldly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it also speaks about their friendship. I really believe they.
Yeah, no, definitely speaks about the friendship. You know, and I get the impression that Sargent was he was a very softly spoken, charming but not overbearing um, man. You know, quite shy, quite ambitious. That he wanted to just show the world how well he could paint his genius through his art. But quite softly spoken guy, not overbearing at all. So interesting that she allowed him into her
Yeah.
life at this stage in her life.
I think they probably just speaks about, the deep friendship that they had and respect for each other.
Mm.
Here is this one. I think we put few of these portraits of the women at the time. Maybe this one is interesting one to point out because this is actually at the Getty.
Yeah,
And
but there's hundreds of portraits like this. I mean, they're just incredible works of art. If you compare this to a Van Dyck or a Velasquez, there is movement in Velasquez paintings, and what Velasquez did was very clever. Of course, but Sargent is doing it over and over and over and over again. It's incredibly hard to do, and he's just doing hundreds and hundreds of these portraits. It's just incredible to think of the amount of work he did at such a high level. If you look at early Velasquez paintings, well, they're interesting because they're not that good. Or you look at early Rembrandt, it's interesting that he painted like this later on, but his early paintings aren't that good. When you look at Sargent's, everything's genius, everything's good, everything, technically everything's incredible.
I think this one is interesting because she looks so thin. I think the big, kind of oversized sofa behind her kind of helps. But at this point, she already had 3 children. So I doubt her waist was, this tiny. And the right hand, we see one of her children actually said that she had a cigarette in her hand. So it's not that she's pointing us to come and join her. She was actually holding a cigarette in those
Yeah,
between.
well, but that was another thing that some people didn't like about Sargent. That he painted them, made them look too good. That he never painted any, like you're talking about the thin hips and he made women look very pretty and things like that. That was considered, he was making them look vain, and that was considered like a negative towards him. So, yeah.
Interesting. This
It's,
is an interesting one because, the Getty, one of the interviews I read on their website, they were speaking, okay, does she belong in European art galleries or American art galleries? And they said they keep him in American art galleries because he was an American. I wanted to just say this was, I had put this, I couldn't help but put a Titian to the right because look just how incredible this portrait of Rubenstiel is from 1902. Uh,
yeah.
I think
Well,
about
I think he was influenced by Titian, but we know for a fact who his big influences were Franz Hals, which is surprising because, Franz Hals isn't everyone's favorite, but, Sargent really, really liked Franz Hals and Velasquez. He loved Velasquez and he loved Rubens as well. Um, but, he would have known Titian, he would have known Tintoretto as well. He would have been influenced by all of these people. And in fact, we have an example, don't we, of some of the influence that Tintoretto had on
we
him.
do. I just wanted to say what Lord said about this. He said, "It has forced greatness on me, which I find quite embarrassing." So he does look like otherworldly gentleman here. But I love the shadow on the wall, which we also see in Titian's as well.
A lot of these portraits were made fun of, though, in the English press. He would
I have
make
to
people.
say, these are quite amazing. These studies that
I
he
love
has.
this one. I think this one's. If I could have any Sargent, I'd probably, it would be one of these. I really particularly like this one. And there's another painting of his friend in the doorway who's an artist, friend of his that he's painted that I love. This one is incredible. Um, just like I said, he just captures. You can really imagine sitting in that room. You can
Yeah.
really imagine being there, can't you? I mean, it's very difficult to paint like that, to really capture the atmosphere like he has. I mean, you can imagine the sort of smells, the sounds of the canal outside, or the birds in the trees. That you can really feel it in this painting and in these paintings that he did. And they're my favorite Sargent paintings, to be honest. His portraits that he did in the grand manner and things like that. I can understand what people mean, the criticism towards those. They are painted in the grand manner. They are of these rich people. They are made to look quite, vain and I can understand that. But I still appreciate them because I look at them for their technical achievement, how difficult it is to do. I understand how difficult it is to do because I tried to paint portraits and I know how difficult it is. But actually, I love these Sargent paintings so much. These ones that he did of his friends traveling, his travel companions. I just think they're my favorite Sargent paintings, and these are the ones that I'd have if I could have a Sargent.
It's interesting to also think this is a hotel room. So obviously they can make their studio wherever they are. And
Yeah,
the straw hat on the right. I love the white on white. I love how he's able to do this. But Sargent actually gave this another title, No Nonsense. I guess kind of referring to them when they're traveling, there's no nonsense. They're just studying, doing their paintings. They're actually busy
yeah.
working.
And
And
that's why he liked to travel with other artists because other artists understand what it is to right. We need to get to work and paint. There's no nonsense. There's no discussion. It's just that's what you have to do. You're an artist, and that's what we do. We paint.
I,
Rather than traveling with someone that didn't live like that. There would be constant distraction. They'd want to go off and do something else. They'd be, come with me. Let's go. I don't know, to the market. Let's go shopping or something like that. He liked to travel with artists, and he liked to paint.
I also love as you said, Velázquez. Here we have a painting in the painting, kind of painting within a painting. And when this painting was sold, I think it was sold to the Boston Museum of Art. The museum director, who was actually a friend, wrote to Sargent and he said, I think he sent him a telegram and he said, "We will take no nonsense from you." So I love that there was this kind of humor between these men. And look,
But there's several watercolors as well of that man, his friend there.
and
You know,
this too, this is again Ambrogio Raffaele posing as the hermit. I mean, when you sent me this one uh, to talk about, I couldn't believe this was actually a work of Sargent. It just looked like something that was done, well, basically contemporary.
yeah, I know the quality of the paint is incredible, isn't it? No one can paint like this.
Yes, yes, yes.
No one can quite paint like Sargent. There's an incredible. Yeah, this one isn't extraordinary. I mean, it looks so biblical, so religious, but it's not. It's just, his friend posing for him, but he just makes him look like like a hermit or a saint or one of the early saints from the Old Testament.
And I love how he can just put a little dab of a color in the eye. He can tell us so much. I also love this one, another of his kind of Alpian adventures when he's going around the Alps. I love that he just paints the people he knew. And there is this Padre Sebastiano who obviously loved kind of going out picking flowers, working with the different scents and recording what he got from the fields. I just love these interior scenes. And you can obviously tell this is an artist who just does this for pure pleasure of recording someone who is dear to him, recording a moment in life.
Yeah, like a diary almost, like,
Yeah.
a diary. He would, this was the day that we
Yeah.
were at this place and I was sat here in this room, like a diary entry. I mean, he didn't write a diary. He didn't really write that much. So this was, for me, this is what I think of, what Sargent was doing when he was painting these paintings. He was basically recording his life like like a diary, but within paint.
I love also in Italy, they always say, don't put your hat on the bed, it's bad luck. But I guess, in early 1900s, that wasn't the case. What is this one? And Nick, I put this one in just for your dad, who kind of comes from the wool industry and cashmere. And I think this is such an incredible work. And it was his niece. So each single of these young women you see is his 11-year-old niece who was posing for him.
Yeah. And that's actually quite a sad story because his niece then died in the war. She was working for the Red Cross, was it? And yeah, this was her, and he was very fond of her. I mean, even though he didn't have a relationship in sort of family or children or anything like that, apparently he was a real family man, and he was very involved with his sister's children, and he was very, very fond of his niece, and he used to travel with his niece, and she died in the war, in the First World War, and that really compelled him to become a war artist and go to the front line and paint for what he saw was the cause, and for the Allied cause. And if you could go ahead, one.
Monique, I just wanted to say, look at her scar. It looks like actually the same shawl that she has on. So there are two different nieces. This is Rosemary, the one who will then lose her life in the bombing. But before she died, and I think in 1914, I'm sorry, 1918, she died in a bombing in Paris, but her husband he died in 1914. So she decides to kind of volunteer her time in a war hospital. But this is a different one, different niece. But look at that same scarf. Here, this is a study for that one. And then I also like here, does that look like the same exact scarf?
Yeah, and
I think there's some details in this one.
the exhibition that was just in London at the Tate was Sargent and Fashion was the name of the exhibition, and he can just paint. He can paint clothing so well. And it does really capture what people were wearing at the time.
Yes. And here is some of the charcoals he wanted to include, which are just extraordinary. I guess this is his way to kind of be able to make some quick commissions, right? Just by doing.
Well, yeah, people would ask him. He was just inundated with commissions for oil paintings for portrait paintings, and instead he said that I've given up painting portrait commissions, but I'll do a quick charcoal of you, and probably took him half an hour at most. So that's what he did later on in his career, and so there's many of these, and they're extraordinary.
Yes, I mean he really truly can. It might be a little bit of Rosalba Carriera, of course, the Rococo artist who worked in pastel. He doesn't kind of feel like Rosalba-esque in his style, and I wanted to include this one just because I'm actually close to Carrara. I'm in Viareggio in Italy. And I think I love that this is, there's actually a letter that someone writes about him. And he says, Sargent slept for weeks in a hut so completely devoid of all ordinary comforts that his companions, far younger men, fled after a few days, unable to stand the Spartan rigors tolerated by their senior with such serene indifference.
Oh, what a man! What a man he was. Really did it for the art. He was probably there for weeks trying to paint this very
Yes.
complicated piece.
And, just exactly the study for this. And I think, just the work that these men would do using really just very old traditional methods. Literally, if someone like Michelangelo went to Carrara, and he did, in 1500s, he would have found these men pretty much doing the same exact thing. And many of these people would actually lose their lives carrying these huge marble blocks down to Carrara. So I kind of want to share this because already here we are kind of going towards the First World War, which it seems that Sargent was not really aware of that much. In fact, when the war started, we know that he's actually kind of on the border between Switzerland and Italy, and he doesn't even have a passport on him. So he's really unaware of really the world of these people that we have been looking at in their beautiful portraits, that Gilded Age was just about to end forever when the war starts. And I just wanted to note, look at these big chords that they're using. We get to see, something like Tintoretto in 1565 when he does this for it's called the San Rocco, and these men using the robes. I think this is something that even probably unknowingly is in kind of visual vocabulary that Sargent has available to him.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then this,
Yeah, you can see the chords on the right hand side were taken from the Tintoretto composition as well. And this is a huge painting, huge painting. It's just astounding what he achieved in his lifetime, how many paintings he achieved on such a scale, to such a high level, technical ability, and sort of the vision that he had, to even come up with something like this, to compose something like this, to come up with the idea in your head, then to compose it on such a scale. It's very, very, very difficult to do all of these things.
And I think when he comes to he's actually sent by the British government to kind of report on the war. And I have to say, that he accepts to do this at the age of 62, to go to the front. And I think he's there for 4 months. And I believe when he arrived, he asked from the generals, everything ceases on Sunday, right? On Sunday is like a rest day. Like he was completely oblivious to what it was to actually be in a war. And then
And imagine what the mustard gas would have been like at the time. It would have been this yellow gas coming over, over the land, and it would have been scary. This sort of chemical warfare that was going on at the time, and these soldiers being blind. So much so that he painted this huge painting called Gassed. I mean, yeah, it must have been shocking at the time. The fact that you could be, in your trench, and this gas would come in and blind you.
Nick, I think also what's interesting here, this is really personal. I think at this point it becomes personal for him when he loses his niece, whose husband, I think this is exactly how he lost his life, with this mustard gas. So I think this is kind of like homage to his own family. But look in the back. I don't have the detail, but all the way in the back, there's actually a soccer play. They're basically playing soccer. So I think it's like a little everyday moment kind of caught as they're going to, I guess.
Can you go in closely? I've never noticed that.
I don't think I can. Let me see if I can zoom. Oh, actually, look. Can you see it bigger? You see? Do you see it too, or no? Or is it just me? Do you see me zooming in?
Yes.
Yeah, I can see.
Perfect. So you see, they're in the back. They're actually. So those that are lucky enough.
Well, yeah, because there's that famous scene of, the Germans playing the British at football, soccer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I think, you saw this in person, Nick, and, I can just imagine how it is to be standing there and kind of you become part of this crowd in the foreground in a way as well. I find that.
Yeah, it's huge. It's to the scale of life. It's the Imperial War Museum in London. It's just incredible.
Look at this. So much like a Tintoretto, just unbelievable.
And again, the greens and the pinks.
Yes, interesting. So he really becomes the someone who records the tragedies of war. I think we only have a few more paintings left. Let me see if I can move forward. Oh yes, this is Franz Holz, and I think this is
Yeah,
like
well, you can see the influence that he would have had, with the group. How do you paint a group? Who do you look to? How do you paint a large group of people together? He would have looked to his heroes to try and understand how to do that.
and I
And
just want
these early Howells paintings are really astonishing. Everyone thinks of Howells, being the sort of drunken, the late paintings of Howells, that are quite slapdash. But his early group portraits that he really made his name in Holland at the time were very, very, very good technically.
interesting. And then look, I just wanted to kind of see what is actually on his tombstone, which I think is so fitting, like for someone like him who painted 800 portraits during his lifetime and then about 1,800 other works of art, not to mention maybe the drawings and things like that. And laborare est orare, to work is to pray. And I guess this really was his way to pray, just working probably every single day as he was growing up.
Yeah. Well, I can understand that.
And
Absolutely.
I think this is absolutely interesting. I'm not really sure what he's adding up here, but there's a little bit of a scene on the right, almost like how Leonardo da Vinci would use the same page. So here's a study kind of a valley, but then he's obviously adding some stuff up, and you kind of wonder, how big was the fortune that he amassed in his lifetime, because he was really well paid for what he did, and I kind of have a
You
sense
can't
that,
take it with you though. Can't take it
yeah.
with you. But yeah, no, he seemed like he lived a very good life. So he had enough money to move around and do what he wanted to do.
Yes. And I have a feeling his sisters were close to him, to his two sisters, and then all the nieces. It feels like they were, very tight-knit family because, of course, their upbringing was so unconventional that they probably
Yeah.
were very close to
Yeah,
each.
you get that feeling. No, definitely. He was a family man. He was very close to his sisters, and
Yeah.
just a good man, a loyal person, a loyal friend, a good friend.
Yeah.
He comes across as a good, really good person, actually.
And, I wanted to finish with this one from the Uffizi just because, of course, it all has to come back to Florence somehow. He was born in Florence after all. And what do you think about this one, Nick?
Well, this is my favorite of his self-portraits that he did, so I'm glad that the Uffizi got the best one. But yeah, this is him later on in his career. Doesn't seem like he painted them particularly, he just did them quite quickly. um, Probably several sittings, and as sort of something to do to keep his eye in or something like that. He didn't really obsess over his self-portraits at all.
And actually, I'm sorry, this is the wrong date. It's 1906. And I even have a huge Uffizi catalog. Let me show you how big that is. Okay. It is this big. Okay. It's I don't know how many pounds this thing is, but I checked to see when it enters the Uffizi gallery. And
But this is in the Vasari corridor, isn't it? Which
it
is the
was
corridor that's dedicated to self-portraits.
yes, which they now emptied out, and it's now just an empty, boring walkway between Uffizi and the Pitti Palace. So this was part of the. I actually saw this in person, and it's actually the Uffizi that Herbert Horn, the collector who lives in Florence, and then he left his collection to the city. So there's a Horn Museum. He actually suggested to the Uffizi director to ask Sargent for a self-portrait, because all of the portraits that were in the Vasari corridor were actually the Uffizi would ask the artists. And this started with Medici Cardinal, who was the first one going to start asking people around him to give a self-portrait as a gift. So in this case, this was the last self-portrait that Sargent would do, and Uffizi asked him. So this was the gift. And I think he even sent it to them with a frame, and there is a signature and the date in the upper left corner. And I just love right here, we don't really see it so prominently as on his teacher, but there is that little red pin of the of the Legion of Honor that was also given to Sargent for his own contribution to art. So in a way, he does the whole circle towards the end of his career.
Yeah, full circle.
Nick, I'm going to stop the share. Oops, sorry. I know we have kind of went along over our time, but Nick, this was so much fun. Should we look at the questions? There is so many questions that we see here. And I think actually Evelyn has raised her hand.
Yes, I have indeed. I have two questions. Firstly, I know that Madame X is supposed to be his big painting, and I get it. It was a big scandal at the time. It was not his greatest painting. It's, for example, my favorite of his is, I don't know the name of it. It seems to be a peasant woman dancing, and the hair is quite loose. It's a little bit from the side. Was it just a scandal of that picture at that time that made it still so big now? Because I think in terms of painting style, I don't see, that it was such fantastic. And my other thing is, the picture was shown no nonsense, and I immediately thought of Sorolla, the Spanish painter. And do you see also a little bit of a connection there? Because I certainly see it sometimes in the way of shadow and light, and also perhaps even of his painting style. And Sorolla also had this big love of family, as apparently Sargent has. Or is it just me who sees that?
No, I think those are two very good points. Yeah, I also think that Madame X is. I think it's iconic, and I think it's it's an iconic, very symbolic kind of unique image. But it's not one of my favorite portraits by Sargent. I completely agree with that. I think it's very odd looking. I think he was trying to push the boat out when he did it. He was young, and he was really trying to make this iconic kind of. This iconic kind of painting, this new sort of portrait, like I said, with this sort of peacock profile and things like that. But I think he went a little bit too far almost, and he was laughed out of town by the French. So it's interesting, that portrait. It's became a very symbolic painting in his career, because it's what ended his career in Paris. But I kind of agree with you. I don't think it's his most successful portrait by any means.
I think it's a little bit. Sorry, I think it's a little bit lacking sensitivity, as some other portraits actually show.
Absolutely, but he was really trying to do that. He was trying to be the talk of the town. He was trying to paint that painting at the time. He was trying to make it, everyone's going to look at this painting in the salon, and it's going to be the painting that everyone talks about. Because when you put a painting into the Paris salon, you wanted to be the artist that people talked about. It had the opposite effect, unfortunately for him, where they laughed at him, and everyone was talking about that painting, but they were talking about it in a negative light. So yeah,
I find it that the drama of it and graphics, it was phenomenal, that portrait.
That's what I was saying. It's very iconic. It's this beautiful icon now, and it's turned into this iconic painting. Like, the paintings have a life of their own. Like the Mona Lisa. It's very hard to look at the Mona Lisa as an objective painting. It's we see it as the Mona Lisa, and Madame X, I think, we see it a little bit like that as well. It's iconic. It's so iconic. I mean, he clearly liked it. He kept it in his studio for 30 years. It's not like he trashed it or threw it away. And he wanted it to be in a museum, in a prominent museum. It went to the Met. So, yeah, I think he tried to design an iconic piece that people would talk about. But it just, sometimes paintings just don't have the effect that you think they will. They have a life of their own. Once you paint them, they're not really yours anymore. They just belong to the world now, and anyone can think or say what they want about them. And then back to Sorolla. Yeah, I think Sorolla was sort of his closest contemporary in terms of what Sorolla was doing with color, how he was painting people in that natural sort of light and things like that. So I think Sorolla is a very, very good comparison. And Sorolla is an incredibly gifted painter as well. But I don't think they came across each other. I'm not sure. I mean, he definitely went to Spain earlier on in his career, but did they meet each other? I'm not sure. There's no information about
Someone is asking, what he thought about photography and did he use photography in his work? I can't imagine him walking around Venice with camera.
Well, that's why the Impressionists started painting so differently because they felt that why do we need to paint to such a high level technically when photography's been invented? We can sort of art has to be, it's not so much technique anymore that matters, because photography's come along. What did Sargent think? There's very little about that. Who knows? I mean, you could tell by the photos that were taken in his studio, he was kind of looking at the camera like, what is this strange technology that we have here? Yeah, it wasn't like today where you just whip out your phone and take, a load of digital photos. I think back then you would have had to come in with quite a big piece of equipment, and you would have had to explain to the person how it works. You'd have had to then told them to sit still. You'd have had to got them into the frame. You'd have to release. It was quite a cumbersome thing. So I think he was sort of looking at the camera like, what is this object that you're using?
Yes. Nick, there's so many comments. Can you actually see the chat, Nick? See if you can without losing us, because there's so many great comments in the chat. There's a wonderful comment. I know the London neighborhood where he lived. I know the London neighborhood where he lived in London. This is a very interesting book about the artist colony there. The Street of Wonderful Possibilities, Whistler, Wilde, and Sargent in Tite Street.
Yeah, Oscar Wilde lived in Tite Street as well. And it was, I mean, it's in Chelsea. A lot of the pre-Raphaelite painters lived around there, and it was, Turner had a studio in the area, but I mean, obviously that was many years before, but it was an artistic area back then. Chelsea at the time was considered, an artist's area to live in, a cheaper rent, not so expensive. It's not like that today.
Someone said he actually considered Boston his home. Interesting.
Yeah, and he was very emotionally involved in painting the murals in Boston. Sorry, I have to turn my head to read the comment. Yeah, no, he was very involved in Boston, definitely. And he was very emotionally invested in painting those murals, which took him about 30 years to complete. And he really sort of gave up portraiture to focus on, landscape painting, but actually doing those murals in Boston, that he considered that to be his sort of Sistine Chapel, in a way. So, he spent a lot of time in Boston and considered it his home when he was in America. Yeah.
And Nick, I'm so glad you mentioned this because actually working on the murals, some of them were done in Boston, but most of them were actually done in his London studio, and then they would be shipped over to be installed. And the reason we're doing this interview actually now is because this year is 100 years of his passing. So on the 14th of April, 1825, he had finished all the paintings. He basically packed them, all the murals. They were supposed to sail to Boston the following morning with Sargent himself. And his sister writes about this, and she said when they packed everything up and they had dinner, he said, well, now my work for America is done, and I guess I can die whenever I please. So he went to sleep, and he actually died in his sleep.
Wow.
Unbelievable. So the ship sailed with his works to be installed in the Boston Art Museum, and they have been kind of everyone flocked in to see them. They were a success right from the start. So I have never been to Boston.
Yeah, well, I think his career in America. I think his career in America was very successful, and he was, like I said earlier on in the talk, he was taken really under, into people's hearts in America. They considered him American. They considered him an artistic hero returning from Europe, and they were very, very generous in America to Sargent. And I think they still are. I think, he's considered an American artist, and I think he should be. You know, he's one of the greatest American artists to ever live, and I think he should be remembered like that.
Yes, yes, totally. I'm really glad, Nick, that we did this. I hope we brought in, if nothing else, I have learned so much about looking at these things and looking at the artists that I didn't really know well. I mean, I've known maybe Madame X would have been a painting I have known, but it's interesting when you study art history, they don't really talk a lot about him. He is dismissed as someone who painted superficial, pretty people and costumes of the time. But I think there is so much more to him.
Yeah, and there really is. There really is. Like I said, it's very hard to place him. He was at a time where the Impressionists were the big, you know, sort of fashionable artist that everyone was talking about. You know, he was an American, but he never really lived in America. It was very hard to place Sargent. He's sort of that transient man of art history that can't really be placed, but is one of the greatest, technically one of the greatest painters to have ever lived. Yeah, and just thank you so much for having me again. I've really enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Paola, and thank you everyone for being here. And it's been wonderful to talk with you all.